Hi, I'm Shannon Gavin Johnson, the director of Legacy Museum on Main, and this is a brief moment in LaGrange's history. Since Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, clothing has had a very large impact on everyday life. Textiles, from the Latin word texere, meaning to weave, or items made of fabric, have touched every level of society, including the poor or enslaved in their homespun coverings, the middling sort with higher quality weaves and a few embellishments, and the aristocrat whose expensive and elaborate garments were a display of their wealth and status. Among the textiles in Troup County Archives collections are the faded sampler on which a young girl practiced her embroidery, a quilt made by an enslaved woman, and the tiny baby gown worn by a beloved grandchild over 150 years ago. One particular piece, though, stands out in my mind. Its slim shirtwaist and collar are accentuated by the smallest black beadwork, while the skirt features two large ruffles. The leg of mutton sleeves were all the rage in the 1890s. As the bustle began to decrease and fashion shifted from an exaggerated posterior to an exaggerated shoulder. Made of copper-colored silk and deep green silk velvet, one would not immediately think of it as a wedding gown. Miss Mary Cook married Mr. Frank Potts in the Long Cane community on September 1, 1892. At noon, the bride walked down the aisle of the Methodist Church in Long Cane wearing the dress that was in perfect style of that time. From the church, the bridal party were driven in carriages to the train station at Gabotville, where they enjoyed a luncheon before the newlyweds departed by train for Atlanta. The dark colors of the dress were certainly befitting the early fall wedding date, but more so, they were not easily dirtied in the dust of the station. The dress was dual purpose, stylish and elegant enough for her wedding, yet structured and hardy enough for travel. It was also not uncommon to choose colors for a wedding dress. Wedding dresses of white are relatively new and only became popular after Queen Victoria wore white to marry Prince Albert in 1840. Occasionally, we receive questions asking what value a garment like this has to the study of history. To answer, we must consider that history is, on a fundamental level, all about understanding the relationships between people and events. What events occurred because of a person's actions, and how did that action ripple out into the community, the nation, or even the world? So what does the fashion of the 1890s and Mrs. Potts' dress tell us? The 1890s were a transitional decade from the stiff Victorian era to the new century. New freedoms drove a decade we now know as the gay 90s. Urban centers were growing and new technologies such as the introduction of electricity into clothing manufacturing greatly influenced design. Women enjoyed new levels of independence. During the decade, the number of women employed outside the home almost doubled. The new woman of the era was an intellectual young female who worked, cycled, and played sports. Even in West Georgia, we find newspaper articles detailing the importance of cycling. Understandably, fashion mimics the time. A lady's dress had to accommodate those activities, and while a wealthy woman would have still regarded the complex rules that governed morning, afternoon, and evening wear, the simplified silhouette was seen throughout the day. Men's wear began to have a significant influence as well. Women's clothing of the era is most marked by the shirtwaist ensemble, as captured in another newlyweds couple's portrait in which Mr. I.N. Phelps Stokes was painted in sporty day wear. We see similar lines in Mrs. Potts' wedding attire. Just as history repeats itself, so too does fashion. Remember the power jacket of the 1980s? Or perhaps Princess Diana's silk taffeta wedding gown with the giant puff sleeves and prominent ruffled neckline. The characters on TV shows like Dynasty and Dallas wore wardrobes of puff shoulder dresses and inspired women all over to stitch extra shoulder pads into their jackets. Interestingly, you may remember the 1980s were similar in some ways to the 1890s. Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed to the United States Supreme Court, Geraldine Ferraro was the first woman vice president nominee, and Sally Ride became the first American woman in space. Women were blazing new career paths, and the power suit, complete with shoulder pads as wide as a linebacker, was a necessity. To learn more about the history of fashion in LaGrange, visit Legacy Museum on Main. This has been a brief moment in LaGrange's history.